We are back on our economy. And before we leave our economy, what I want to do is make sure that you fully understand the implications, why, understanding how everything works together, the decisions that you make in your household, how those get magnified and multiplied throughout our entire economy, and how those decisions can improve overall what happens. So I'm going to go back to my standard diagram where we have, here we have the central bank, also known as the Fed, and we're going to have our three tiers of banks, which is retail, right, corporate banks, investment banks, commercial banks. Then we have companies like Target, McDonald's, Walmart, and then down here we have you and me. All right, so this is our economy and this is how things are moving. Everything that happens in here is comprised of all the activity we have. So on a daily basis, if you go to the drive-through, you are getting a service. Someone's preparing food for you. You're buying a good, which is that donut or that sandwich or that Coke. If you go to the university, you're getting an education. The professor's providing the education. If your lawn gets mowed, then the lawnmower's providing that service. You get your hair cut, the hairdresser's providing that service. So all day long, we are consumers of goods and services, and we provide goods. We make goods in our industry at work, or we provide a service. So as this moves along, I'll remind you that one person's spending is another person's income. So when you spend money, it becomes someone else's income. So what I want to cover is what a recession is. So a recession is when GDP decreases for 2 consecutive quarters. Now, what is a quarter? Well, in the financial industry, we measure the productivity, we measure what a company does, sales, growth, management, all those things on a quarterly basis. And there are 4 quarters to the year, so 1 quarter equals 3 months. So the first quarter goes through the end of March, the second quarter goes through the end of June. That's 2 quarters. So when we have GDP decrease or shrink for 2 consecutive quarters, that is officially a recession. And that means that our market's pulling back. What is GDP? Well, GDP is gross domestic product. Gross meaning all, covering all. Domestic, what happens in our economy in the United States, and product, what we're producing. So gross domestic product, it's the sum of all goods and services that are being produced and consumed within an economy within a certain period of time. So we can measure GDP for 1 quarter, we can measure it for the year, we can measure it over a decade and see where we are. Now our GDP, let's go here, our GDP ultimately is going to be a number. And we compare this number, the US versus China, or the US versus Mexico, or Canada, or Japan. And why do we do that? Because we want to see this GDP figure shows if our economy is moving along, if we're healthy, if we're thriving, if we're producing, consuming, buying, selling, if we're doing all of these things. If we're not, this slows down and it starts to shrink. So recession is when things slow down enough that GDP actually shrinks and it goes back. Now, when we face a recession, when we're inside a recession, because things are moving so slowly, what we have are layoffs. So people lose their jobs. When they lose their jobs, we have foreclosures. People lose their homes. The banks call the loans for homeowners not paying on the mortgage, and then they take the property back. Now people are out of a home. We also have evictions, repossessions. Now remember that one person's spending is another person's income. So if we have an eviction, then that means somebody's not paying their rent. If they're not paying their rent, that's the landlord not getting that income. If the landlord's not getting that income, then the landlord can't spend that money on a vacation, or the landlord can't invest in another building. And so without that income, the landlord can't spend and buy at a restaurant or at a store. And if they can't spend at a restaurant and a store, then the store is losing business and the store slows down and the store has to lay people off. And those people that are laid off can't pay their mortgages, so they get foreclosed on. Or they can't pay on their cars and the cars are repossessed. So what you want is an economy where people are able to buy a car at a good rate, where it's not moving up in price too fast. It's maintaining an appropriate level of appreciation. So when somebody buys a car, that spending becomes the car dealership's income. And that income then gets invested back into the business and pays the salaries of everyone that works at the dealership. So a recession is going to have layoffs, foreclosures, evictions, repossessions. It's also going to have a consolidation of businesses. So poorly run businesses, mismanaged businesses are going to get eaten and consumed by bigger businesses that are able to withstand a slow market. And so it's called an efficient market. And basically, if you are a small business that aren't prepared to withstand this storm, then you get eaten by another one. And that could be an aggressive takeover, or it could just be a business so efficient that they're able to withstand something small, and then they end up gaining more market share when the market's slow. And then when it picks up, that medium-sized or big business that just ate up more of its competitors grows to be even bigger. And that's how the market runs. But understanding, again, a recession is when all of this buying, spending, producing, consuming slows down and shrinks to the point where we have 2 consecutive quarters. So that's 6 months. Now, when we see that, we actually have to wait for the 6 months to transpire. We can't say definitively, oh, we're in a recession right now. Certainly it looks like it, but if the market were to turn around at the end or pick up, and we were to add jobs and we have more spending, and GDP actually grows versus declining, then we weren't in a recession. So you could have GDP shrink for 1 quarter, it could grow the second quarter, and they could shrink again. That's not a recession. The recession would be 2 consecutive quarters where GDP shrinks. All of these things, layoffs, foreclosures, evictions, repossessions, these affect us on a day-to-day basis. And that's why I want you to understand how it relates to the big picture of what's happening here and how we measure ourselves, our economy, against other economies. So that covers it for this lesson.